Tzvi, you have to unmute.
Good morning. My name is Tzvi Marins, and I am a past president of Jewish Federation of Northern New Jersey. I want to welcome you here this morning for this very important program. First, I'd like to thank Lee Lasher, our president, and Jason Shamus, our CEO and executive vice president, Laura Freeman, and all the other staff for setting these programs up. This has been a difficult time for the Jewish community, as we have watched over the last few weeks the violence and terror that our Israeli brothers and sisters have been experiencing. The tenuous ceasefire brings us some comfort that at least the violence may end, but then the healing must begin. This is the third of a series of conversations created by Federation to provide perspective from Israelis who are on the ground, living through this day after day. This morning, I'm pleased to welcome Herb Keinon, a journalist and analyst for the Jerusalem Post. Herb is a senior contributing editor and analyst at the Jerusalem Post, writing extensively on diplomacy, politics, and Israeli society. He has been with the paper for 35 years and covered stories from the First Intifada to the withdrawal from Gaza, the assassination of Rabin, Soviet Jewry movement, the various premierships from Ariel Sharon to Bibi Netanyahu. Herb also writes a monthly light column on the daily life in Israel. He is originally from Denver, Colorado, and has lived in Israel for the past 37 years. A minute about the structure. I'm going to hand over the floor to Herb for a 5 to 10 minute overview. Then I'll get back on and Herb and I will have a chat. I'll ask some questions. And then if the audience has any questions, please put them into the Q&A icon on the bottom of your screen. And if there is time and we haven't covered it, we'll be happy to do it. I plan for this to be up to 45 minutes, anywhere from 30 to 45 minutes. So hope you enjoy this, and I hand it over now to Herb.
Thank you, Tzvi. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me. Look, well, what's the situation on the ground right now? There's a ceasefire. The ceasefire went into effect at 2 a.m. Now it's 3:30 p.m. here. So far, it's held. I imagine it's going to hold at least for a number of months, maybe even for a number of years. The test will be not whether Hamas will fire off rockets now. They won't, because they've been hit and they've been hit hard. The test will be what happens when the court case on Sheikh Jarrah, the neighborhood in Jerusalem, comes up. And Hamas, even if they don't send over rockets, what's Israel going to do if they send over inflammable balloons again, right? Then what? Then what will Israel do? That's going to be the test. Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu, in a speech he gave just a couple hours ago, summing up the operation, said from now on, Israel is not going to tolerate any kind of dribble, anything coming out of Gaza, and that if that happens, Israel will respond with full force. We'll see where that goes. We'll see whether they actually do that. Netanyahu and Defense Minister Benny Gantz were both very careful in the beginning of the operation in not setting overly grandiose goals. They didn't talk about defeating Hamas because they know that that's extremely difficult. They didn't talk about reconquering Gaza because nobody really wants to do that. They talked about getting quiet or providing security and long-term quiet. Now, the way they set about doing that was twofold. First, to significantly degrade Hamas's military capabilities. And the second is just to knock them in the head psychologically so that they realize that it's just not worth their while to do this again. There are parallels here. I've been here a long time. I feel parallels between how we left the Second Lebanon War in 2006, and there was kind of a sour feeling among much of the country that it didn't go well and that Israel didn't attain its objectives. I think to a certain extent amongst some you have the feeling like that today. But I would also note that even though we did have that feeling in 2006 from Lebanon, since that time it's been quiet. Right, we've had 15 years from quiet from Lebanon. The hope is that you have a similar type of situation now coming out of Gaza. As there's going to be victory rallies in Gaza. Those victory rallies are complete and utter nonsense, right? They have the same thing with Hezbollah, have the same type of rallies in Lebanon as well. And let's see what happened in this campaign. They fired 4,400 rockets at Israel. And amazing, miraculous, 92% of them were intercepted by the Iron Dome, right? After 11 days, 4,400 rockets, they killed 12 people, nine Israelis, 3 foreign workers. 2 of the Israelis were Arabs from Lud. Every loss is tragic, obviously, but imagine what would have happened if there wasn't an Iron Dome. Their attack tunnels were taken out. Defensive tunnels were destroyed. This metro underneath Gaza where they hid and they fired from. The missile production capacities were hit. They lost, according to the IDF, 180 terrorists, some of their top level command officials. Command centers were hit. Buildings were taken down. Those kind of victories, if that's a victory for Hamas, right? Then I wish them more types of victories because they did take an extremely heavy blow. What did Israel gain from all this? Hopefully it hit their capabilities and will now have some quiet. If you can get 5, 10, 15 years of quiet, that's nothing to sneeze at. But I think at the same time, there's going to be a growing call inside Israel to start to rethink things as well. I mean, Israel left Gaza in 2005, 16 years ago. We've had a major military operation 6 times since then, right? 6 times. That's one of these every 2.5 years ago. That's unsustainable. So there has to be some kind of more creative thinking about what do? You just can't keep Hamas there and live with this situation where every 2.5 to 3 to 5 years you're going to have these rounds. What can you do to move them out? How can the international community move them out? So I think you're going to see some new thinking saying this is just an intolerable situation, can't go on forever. Let's rethink it. Let's rethink the arrangement we have with Gaza. One last thing. We all knew that, eventually that the rockets were going to be quieted from Gaza. And then we're going to be left to have to, rebuild on the debris. But I think the main debris that Israel is going to have to rebuild right now has to do with less Gaza and more what happened inside Israel during these 11 days. The riots in the mixed towns, the looting, the destruction of synagogues, the Arab riots, the violence on random individuals. That revealed something that I think many people here just didn't want to see, and that the rifts between the Arabs and the Jews here are a lot wider than we thought. We actually thought they were coming together, that there was more integration, that the Israeli Jews were willing to integrate the Arabs into the society more, and the Arabs were willing to integrate more into the society. This comes, it hits you like a smack in the face, and it's going to cause a lot of rethinking. So again, the missiles stopped from Gaza. You got quiet in Gaza right now. Now I think a lot of the soul searching among Israelis is how do we deal with what's going on inside the country with the Israeli Arabs. So let me just stop there, kind of as opening comments, and let's open it up for conversation.
All right. So thank you for those opening remarks, Herb. I'd like to divide this down, if we can, to just general overview, security and national issues, and then maybe draw on your experience specifically as a journalist, and then a little bit of personal. So first of all, there's been a lot of talk about the Abraham Accords, obviously, and I think that the idea behind the Abraham Accords was to be able to bypass the Palestinian issue, or at least put it aside and have the Palestinians issue kind of running up behind. Do you think that this has put an end to that idea, or this too shall pass and we'll be able to move along with the Abraham Accords?
Look, I think it's interesting when you look at the Abraham Accord, you look at the ties with the UAE, the Emirates, the Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan, and you look how they responded during this crisis. The response was pretty muted, right? I mean, they gave some lip service, but it wasn't nearly what we've seen from those countries in the past. I think one of the reasons that Netanyahu wanted to go for a ceasefire, even though politically he's going to get raked across the coals because of the fear that if this thing had continued, it would have developed problems on the streets for the UAE and for the Bahrainis that they would have to deal with. Believe me, the governments in the UAE and Bahrain, they're not weeping in quiet over what Israel did to Hamas. This is Muslim Brotherhood backed by Iran. They see them as their enemy as well. But they have a street that they have to deal with, and the sentiment on the street. As far as the whole, philosophy behind the Abraham Accords, that if you start from the outside, you start to have relations with the Arab countries, and then you move inside to the Palestinians. I'm not sure that's over. I'm not sure it's dead. The main impetus, though, for this, remember, the main impetus for the Accords was Iran and the fear of Iran, and that's still there. In fact, it's there perhaps now even stronger because Iran had a heavy footprint in this, right? Iran's involvement in this was key, it was essential. Iran are the ones who've been paying for these rockets, given them technology, right? 4,400 rockets, that's a lot of money. That's coming from somewhere. So the guiding principle behind the Abraham Accords was actually we have common interest. The main common interest is the fear of Iran. That hasn't changed. So I don't see any altering right now in the Abraham Accords.
Okay, good. Thank you. So let's shift a little bit to American Jews, since that's where we're from, and you are still an American Jew, even though you're an Israeli Jew. Clearly we have a sense in this country that there's been a shift in this country, especially in the progressive Democrats and on the street. Do you have any insights from your perch about what's going on? Is this just much of the same? Is this a seminal shift or somewhere in between?
Look, I mean, Noam Chomsky, right? Noam Chomsky's been out there for a long time. He's not a new voice. He's also been a voice, a Jewish, far left, radical left voice, anti-Israel for decades. So it has been there. I think it's grown. It's obviously grown. I think there are more voices like that, and they get amplified as a result of the social media, right? The press is not going to cover a Jew who comes out and says, "I love Israel." The press will cover a Jew who comes out and says, "I can't stand Israel." Right, he'll cover him, and that guy will get a lot of coverage and a lot of space to vent his venom. So I do think it's growing. I think it's being a little bit overplayed by the press because it fits into a certain agenda that I think to a certain degree the press wants to move forward, and that is, look, the American Jews are moving away from Israel. Look, there was an article yesterday in the New York Times about how the American Jews have reacted differently this time in the past. If you read the story, I think you only see one voice which kind of supports that thesis, but it's a thesis that the Times is interested in promoting. Why is that thesis a bit pernicious? It's pernicious because if people in Congress don't believe that Israel is any more important for the Jewish people themselves, then they're not going to put out their neck to support Israel. So I think it's a dangerous thesis. And again, there are those who want to push that agenda. Again, I'm not downplaying the fact that there are a lot of folks out there, a lot of these radical leftist progressives, Jews who don't like Israel. Their voices are being amplified. It's easy to knock on Israel if you can then point to Peter Beinart and say, "Look, don't blame me. Look what he's saying." But I wouldn't blow it out completely out of proportion. I think that the masses of American Jews still very supportive.
Okay, from not from a political standpoint, but from a strategic standpoint, how do you think Biden has been handling this and the impact on Israel?
Look, I think it's funny because I think both on the right and in Israel, and the Israeli right and the Israeli left, I think there's disappointment in Biden. I think the right is disappointed because he was too supportive. They kind of wanted to see a reincarnation of Barack Obama, and on the left they were disappointed because he was too supportive. They wanted to see much more pressure. Overall, I think in Jerusalem, in the Prime Minister's office, there's an appreciation for how Biden played this. How did he play it? He first came out and said, without any equivocation at all, saying Israel has the right to defend itself. No ifs, no buts, no proportionality, has the right to defend itself. It then took him 10 days for him to say, I support a ceasefire. Now, that was trumpeted in the press as Biden placing pressure on Israel. Believe me, I know what pressure on Israel is to withdraw. I covered 2002, the Second Intifada. Ariel Sharon, after the Passover Eve massacre in Netanya, brings the troops back into the West Bank, into Jenin. George Bush, right? George Bush, big supporter of Israel, stands up in Crawford, Texas, in front of the cameras and says, I call on Israel to withdraw now, and they better heed my call. That's pressure, right? You didn't hear that from Biden. The next day he says, I want to see a de-escalation. So he gave Israel 10 days to do everything that Israel thought they needed to do, which I think is appreciated. There's also something interesting in the way he, even if there were differences, right? Even if there was a lot of pressure going on behind the scenes, you didn't see it, right? You didn't see it. Saying I expect a de-escalation is not pressure. And that's a big difference between this administration and the Obama administration when they would put that out there, right? And that hurt us strategically because then your enemies saw, that there was a wedge being placed between Israel and the U.S. Hamas was testing America here as well to see how they would line up, right? And for the most part, right, you can't fault Biden for the way he performed here.
I think also the Security Council blocking all the resolutions.
Right, 3 resolutions he blocked, and again, and he's coming under a lot of pressure from his home base or from the progressives inside the party. He stood firm against them.
Yep, that's good.
Also today, he made a statement with it today or yesterday saying that I will replenish the Iron Dome. Believe me, there are a lot of folks out there in his party or among the progressives who don't want to hear that from the President of the United States.
Right. So that there was a question actually about that. Have we used up our supply of Iron Dome? Are we running low? Do we have plenty? Are there more things on the future, on the horizon regarding this type of defense?
Look, I don't, I mean, I don't know what the stocks of munitions are. That's kind of a guarded secret. I'm not sure we're really going to know that. I imagine that Israel, is going to restock as much as they can, fearing what's going to happen. Look, there was a watershed moment in 1991. 1991 was a watershed moment in Israeli history. Why? Because George Bush, the father, went into Iraq. And when he did that, what did Saddam Hussein do? He fired his Scuds onto Israel. From that moment, the penny dropped, and everybody here realized, the strategic thinkers realized, that from now on, any confrontation, it's not our tanks against their tanks in the Sinai or in the Golan Heights, it's their missiles against our kindergartens, their rockets against our shuls, our synagogues, right? So you have to build a three-tiered anti-missile defense system, which we began working on in earnest in 1991. You've got the Arrow to deal with the missiles from Iran. You've got the David Sling to deal with the rockets from Lebanon. And thank God you've got Iron Dome, and we've seen the effectiveness of that. Is Israel going to progress now? Look, I mean, what do we learn from this last conflict? That the way Hamas thought that they could outsmart the Iron Dome is just fire a huge barrage at the same time towards the same location. And statistically, a certain number of rockets are going to get through. I would imagine, right, that those who developed Iron Dome are going to go back to the drawing board, right, and they realize this new tactic, and they'll find a way to deal with this new tactic.
Okay, good. I'd like to shift a little bit now into your experience specifically as a journalist. I was concerned. I read an article in Times of Israel by Tal Schneider about the safety of Israeli journalists, I think in Israel. Is that an issue? Is that a change? How does that impact on your life?
Look, I mean, there's a toxic atmosphere, and there's a very emotional atmosphere, and there's a lot of hotheads out there. We're going to take it out on journalists. So we saw over the last couple of weeks that in riots that happened in Lod and Ramla and Akko, that it was taken out on the journalists. Obviously, that's to be condemned. That's bad. But again, I don't feel danger. I don't have a recognizable face, right? I could walk into Lud and nothing's going to happen to me. I'm not on television. So I personally don't feel it. I think it's something that has to be condemned from the top. It's a problem, but again, I wouldn't overblow it. I mean, the journalists aren't walking around here right now fearing for their lives.
Okay, good. Well, I'm happy for that. And also another thing that I had mentioned that we would talk about is when Israel blew up the Al-Jalaa, I think I'm saying it right, Al-Jalaa building in Gaza, that 11-story building that was a Hamas center. Obviously, the AP and other news organizations were there, and they created a lot of noise about it. I haven't heard a lot of noise recently. I wonder whether or not the info that was sent over the United States was definitive. But what is your sense of that? Your sources? Is it real? That Hamas was there, and what is the status of AP vis-a-vis the Palestinians in Israel?
Look, as far as a building is concerned, I mean, my understanding is it's real. It was a Hamas, it was their intelligence headquarters. They had offices, the intelligence headquarters there. Look, Israel's not stupid. It's the IDF is not going to. There's a bank of targets that are very carefully selected. It's not, you just pick out a big building, you want to knock it down. This thing was studied. It was looked at. I hope that it was looked at from all the different aspects, including the aspects of what it's going to do as far as, Israel's position in the world. And it was still decided, right? Again, it was decided with shikul dat, with consideration that this is a strategic asset that needs to be taken out. In previous rounds, Hamas offices in that building were hit, pinprinted. Are very, carefully hit. The offices, not the whole building. So those journalists who were there, AP, apparently they knew what was in the office, or otherwise Israel wouldn't have hit it in the past. But they stayed there. It's a problem. You say it's been quiet recently about this issue. It hasn't come up that much more. I imagine that the intelligence information that Israel gave to the Americans, because you're not hearing any formal protest from the U.S. government. kind of, settled them down, that this wasn't, something that Israel was trying to do to silence journalists. I mean, that's crazy. Israel didn't take out that building to silence AP. And I'm sure that they realized the ramifications of that, but they still thought that it was an important enough strategic target to take it down.
Okay, let's take a break and just ask you personally, tell us about your family and what your status is and how you're managing personally.
Look, yeah, I live in Mala Domain, which is just outside of Jerusalem. So it's been relatively quiet out here, right? I mean, because I live, I'm on the other side of the Green Line. They're not going to fire rockets out here, because if they miss, they're going to hit, Arab neighborhoods or Arab communities. So we haven't had that tension of having to run into a safe room, right? I mean, you can only imagine, people who are in Tel Aviv, parents 90 years old, trying to get into a safe room with the walkers. It's a horrible thing. It creates a great deal of tension. So that tension I haven't felt personally. But there's other types of tension that you feel. I mean, I got 4 kids, all grown kids. 3 of them are, they were in combat units in the army. They're waiting by the phone to see if they're going to get called up to reserves. I've got 2 kids who live in Yudav Shimron. You're worried about, what's going to happen there. Today, by the way, this is interesting to watch what happens today, because they call it a day of rage in the West Bank and Yudav Shimron. So, I mean, you're worried about them on the road. So there's a tension that impacts on everybody. And that's important. It's important that everybody feels it, because I think one criticism in the past has been that, well, when they're just firing rockets on Sderot or in Kfar Aza down near the border, it's Poseidon. That's what they do. They live with it, just like they used to do it on Kiryat Shmona. Once they lob them towards Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, it's a different story. And for everybody to feel that same sense of insecurity, it will make people realize, no, it's intolerable if it happens there as well, not only in Tel Aviv, but also in Sderot. And there's just one other thing I like to say, and this is something that I think people abroad often miss. This stuff has an impact on the Israeli psyche. It matters. The fear matters. The insecurity matters. It's not unremembered the next day, right? This is, a lot of people went through hell over the last week and a half, and that's going to shape what they think the country should do next time, how the country should operate, and how they vote. But the best example of this is the Second Intifada. The Second Intifada fundamentally changed Israel. It's not the same country today as it was beforehand. Why? Because everybody felt that mind-numbing terrorism. Everybody felt it, and it changed. I mean, it's no coincidence that the country, hasn't had a left-wing prime minister since Ehud Barak in 1999, and that over the last 4 elections has voted consistently for right-wing parties. Not necessarily for Bibi, but for right-wing parties. This stuff matters. It impacts the psyche of the country, and people who want to understand Israel, I think, need to understand that.
No, there's no surprise, as you were saying, is that terrorism is terror. That's what terrorism is. It's to inflict terror on the civilian population. All right, so you touched on now the politics. Everybody has a view on it. It's astounding to me, the 9 lives that Bibi Netanyahu has. Just when you think it's all over, it's not all over. What's the impact of this war or campaign that will have on the coalition building and on Bibi's future? In 1 minute.
It is ironic. It's ironic in the sense that in 1996, if you remember back in 1996, just after Yitzhak Rabin's assassination, Shimon Peres was prime minister. He called an election because he wanted to win an election on his own right. He wanted to step out of the shadows of Rabin. He called an election. The polls were incredibly showing that he was going to clean up. He had Bill Clinton, have a big conference for him in Sharm el Sheikh. It looked like there was going to be a clear victory for him, right? And then Hamas set off a series of horrible suicide bus bombings, right? And Bibi Netanyahu just barely won that election. Fast forward 25 years, Monday on May 10th, right? Just before, 2 hours before the rockets go off in Jerusalem, this anti-Bibi coalition made of the right and the left, they're about to make an announcement. And the announcement is, we've got it. We're going to join together. We're going to include this new Arab party led by Mansour Abbas, who's willing to deal with the Jewish governments and even right-wing governments. We have a coalition. Then what happens? All hell breaks loose. Naftali Bennett from the Yamina party looks around. He sees that his public, following what happens in Lod and in Ramla, the burnings of the synagogues, they're not crazy right now of joining forces to form a government with an Arab party which didn't condemn what was going on. Right. So Bennett says then it's over. I'm not going with Lapid. That coalition is over. Now what's happened, we're now 11 days after that. The dust is starting to settle down. Some people are urging Bennett, yes, to work with the coalition. I don't necessarily see it happen because I think Bennett is looking towards the future. Someday he wants to replace Bibi on the right. You're not going to do that by going in right now in a government being supported by an Arab party. So it has reshuffled the deck. Lapid has until June 5th to form a government. If he doesn't form a government by June 5th, it goes to the Knesset. The Knesset has 31 days to rally around one guy. Right? If they got one guy that 61 people can agree on, then you have a prime minister. Is it going to happen? God only knows. I mean, it's unclear. It's unclear. I mean, there are forces, political forces, who don't want an election. Bennett doesn't want an election. This Mansour Abbas doesn't want an election. Bibi would not mind an election. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure. To be frankly, it's tough for journalists to say, I don't know, but I don't know. Nobody can tell you really what's going to happen.
Okay. A very specific question that came up, and I realize it's good to ask you as a journalist. There was a lot of talk about when Israel was about to invade or pretending to invade, and the officer who was the press, whoever it was, announced it. Do you know, what's your sense? Was this completely designed to deceive, or was this a little bit of a fumble? What does that do in terms of the relationship of the world to the Israeli press hasbara?
Look, whether it was designed or it was a fumble, I'm not sure. I mean, it happened. The IDF spokesman later said that it was a mistake. It's kind of tough to believe. That's a pretty serious, mistake. Saying when the ground troops went in, when the ground troops didn't go in. So they say it's a mistake. I don't know. I don't know. I can't give you a definitive active whether or not it is. As far as, I mean, this is a war, right? And it was a deceptive ploy, perhaps. And if it was a deceptive ploy that would have worked, and we would have, killed hundreds of Hamas terrorists inside the tunnels, is it worth, getting the head of AP angry for a couple of weeks? Perhaps. Now, there will those who will say, well, but you're destroying the trust between the foreign media and the IDF spokesman. You're hurting the coverage that Israel's getting around the world. I'm looking at the coverage, right? And I'm saying, hey, I mean, we're not, it's not exactly roses out there as far as the coverage anyhow. So it'll be tougher for another couple of weeks. Is that the end of the world? I'm not so sure. In the end, AP needs the IDF spokesman, just as the IDF spokesman needs AP. They'll figure out a way to kind of work together again. There's not a lot of trust among the foreign press towards Israeli spokesmen and spokespeople or officials anyhow. Was it hurt? Yeah, it was hurt. Is it the end of the world? I don't think it's the end of the world.
All right. And then what do you think of the PR difficulties that we have in the world press? There's one side that says we have to do everything we can to make it work and to make it good. And the other side says, why bother? It's not going to make a difference anyway. We have to do what we have to do and let the chips fall where they are.
Look, I think you have to have realistic expectations. I think that Israel, obviously you have to invest in it. You have to get good people involved in it, but you have to, also have, the realistic expectations that if you have a picture of, pulling a kid out of a little 6-year-old girl out of the rubble in Gaza, it's going to be difficult to combat that optic. That's an optic that pulls at the emotional heartstrings. We have an argument that plays to the mind. We can give it context. There's oftentimes not enough time for that type of context, and people don't want to hear that context. But you gotta continue just to put the truth out there. Hopefully, that the reasonable people, and there are reasonable people, right? The reasonable people will hear your arguments. Those who hate you, doesn't matter what you say, right? But there's a reasonable center. The pernicious thing that I've seen over the last few days, and I'm talking about this John Oliver thing, right? What was the problem with the John Oliver skit? Was it was all, it was completely void of context. There was no context, right? If 250 Palestinians are killed and only 12 Israelis were killed, and Israel has a defense system, the Palestinians never don't because they didn't invest in it, right? Then it's clear who's in the right and who's in the wrong. I, John Oliver, will make that moral judgment. That's a ridiculous argument stripped of any context. It's like saying that because the German civilians lost 500,000 people in World War II and the Brits only lost 67,000, that means that the Nazis had the moral right on their side. It's a crazy argument, and I think it's necessary for Israel and Israel supporters to, to take that argument head on and just say it's nuts. You need context. There is context, and even though it might take time, you've got to understand that context.
Okay, so this has been a whirlwind, and really, I thank you for your comments and the insights. We hope that there'll be at least a temporary lasting peace. I don't know if permanent lasting peace is on the horizon, but at least temporarily, and that everybody in the country can get their break and really use, we didn't even talk about COVID. When was the last time we had a half an hour webinar? We didn't even mention the word COVID. But it seems to be done in Israel, and hopefully it's getting done here in this country as well. So we really want to thank you for your insights, commentary, and clarity and understanding of this very complex situation. As an American, an Israeli, a journalist, you certainly bring a unique and nuanced perspective that we greatly value. We hope you stay safe and keep your family safe. And of course, we'll keep an eye out for your reporting and analysis in the Jerusalem Post. So I want to thank everyone for joining us this morning. This is yet another example of the value that Federation brings to the community, not just supporting other agencies, but really bringing content and timely content and great people like Herb. I want everybody to have a nice and safe weekend, and Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Thank you.